Hello again, Ali here, just going through some of the content related to herbicides, how they work. And in our previous video, we discussed about what weeds are, what sort of chemicals we use to control them. And then we went through the classification, how different types of herbicides are working, and how do we sort of look at when they act in plants physiology. So in this brief video I just wanted to discuss a little bit about um, a concept called herbicide resistance. So think about if you ever had to take some antibiotics and at some stage they weren't functional. So that means your body evolved resistance against those antibiotics medicines. Uh, Same mechanism also works in plants where we apply certain chemicals to kill the plants, and at some stage we see that plants are not getting controlled by that chemical anymore, and that phenomenon is called herbicide resistance. Why plants evolve resistance? It's basically a process of natural selection. So it's a numbers game. In each population, there are always some individual plants that are a bit more tolerant against certain chemicals. What happens when we apply same chemical over and over again? At some stage we will get to a threshold where we have wiped out most of our susceptible individuals in that population, and what's left is plants that were inherently tolerant, but they have multiplied. How? Because every season, think about, you kill the susceptible ones and the resistant ones would survive. They go on to produce seed, and that seed would produce more plants, and at some stage we will see the resistant or tolerant individuals, they will be the dominant ones in that population. And when we get to that threshold, we start seeing herbicide failures. So think about a farmer. They went into the field, sprayed a certain chemical, thinking that it would provide them effective control of a specific weed, and all they see is a lot of happily growing weeds. Why? Because most of them are survivors. They did not get killed by that herbicide, and that's how herbicide resistance is a massive issue in agriculture. It's one of the biggest constraints when it comes to weed management and crop production. So just to give you an example, we have this plant here. It's called annual ryegrass. It's, as you can tell, grass species. The scientific name is Lolium rigidum, and it's got an interesting story. So it was introduced in Australia as a pasture species, planted pretty much all over the Australia, and since sheep numbers gone down, a lot of that land was converted to grain production systems to grow wheat, barley, and so on. And at that time, this very desirable pasture species became a weed because we did not need ryegrass to grow on the land. We wanted to grow faba beans or wheat or lentils, for example. So this particular weed has so many different characteristics which make it highly problematic. It's an obligate outcrosser. It produces lots of seeds, several thousand per plant. And if we look at this plant, as fragile as it looks, it has completed its life cycle, already shed a lot of seed, but these are the sort of, if you look at these spikelets, each one of those would have seed, and once it completes the life cycle, it deposits seed into this soil. One would think why it would be so problematic from control point of view, mainly because it has evolved resistance to pretty much most post-emergent herbicides we have been using in grain production systems, and quite a few pre-emergent herbicides as well. So if you have thousands of these plants growing in your wheat crop, they not only steal moisture, light, nutrients from your wheat crop, but also produce lots of seed that goes back into the soil and become a persistent problem for years to come. So that's just one example. If you look at the slide deck accompanied with this particular video, you will be able to see there are some other examples of herbicide resistant weeds. And I've also got a nice graph showing the trajectory of herbicide resistance evolution worldwide. And as you can see, it has exploded exponentially over the last few decades, mainly because of heavy reliance on single site of action or mode of action. And as I mentioned before, if you keep using the same chemical, that means it's wiping out all the susceptible individuals for that chemical, and all we left with is the resistant population. So that's how herbicide resistance works. So how do we know that a population has evolved resistance? We do a lot of extensive testing. So it starts with, getting the seed from survived populations from the previous crop, and then grow them out, apply different chemicals in a dose response fashion, and that way we can understand how much resistance is there, but more importantly, what are the thresholds for different plant species to adapt and to tolerate the levels of herbicides. So I thought it would be good to give you a glimpse of one ongoing experiment and how it links with the herbicide resistance. So what we have here is excuse me, a few different pots of a species. It's called gazania. So again, it's an interesting weed. It was introduced as an ornamental plant in nurseries and urban settings, but it has escaped the gardens and now it has become quite a problematic weed in southern Australia. What this plant does is that it can tolerate high levels of herbicides, a lot of different chemicals. So in this particular experiment, we are looking at how it responds to different doses of a specific chemical. So I'll just show you a quick sort of overview. So the chemical we're using here is called Lontrel. It's a persistent residual herbicide. It can stay in the soil system for quite some time, often used in some crops, but mainly in non-cropped areas and pasture settings due to its long persistence. Why we need such a robust chemical to control these plants? Because it has certain botanical features that make it highly competitive. So it has rhizomes from which it can regrow. So if you kill the foliage only, you're not going to get good control. So in this experiment, we are comparing a few different doses, and based on that, we will understand what level of resistance it has. So starting from left here, we can see this is, as you could see, control. So this plant has not been sprayed with any chemical, and as you could see, although it's kind of nearing the completion of its life cycle, it's still healthy growing plant, produced a lot of flowers and seed, and still sort of going well. Whereas where we sprayed 150 grams of active ingredient of Lontrel, you don't see a lot of difference, although it made a little bit of difference in growth, but you still see a lot of leaves still healthy and green, growing well. As we move along the concentration gradient, so it's the dose up to sort of 450 grams of active ingredient per hectare, and we have 300 grams. As you can see, clear differences. So the higher the dose, the better the control, but still not 100% effective control. So if we could zoom in, when we talk about weed control, so there are so many different symptoms that would appear, and it depends really on the type of chemical you spray. So on the slide deck, there will be some examples of herbicide symptoms in previous sort of introduction to herbicides slides. And there's bleaching, there is necrosis, chlorosis, and so on. which happens in response to herbicides. So as you could see, these leaves here, they're pretty much dead. They showed bleaching initially, then they had chlorosis, and eventually due to necrosis they sort of died. And this is a typical example of some sort of necrosis, but still not 100% effective control. If we look at even further higher doses, which is actually above label rate, so this particular dose, it would be in a label application. What is recommended, if they applied, let's say, 300 grams active ingredient, it's not going to control these plants out in the field. So why we have this kind of really high rates? Because we want to see how much resistance there is, and the higher the rates, the more I guess effective control. But it also gives us an indication that although it has evolved resistance to label rates, it's probably still controllable if there are really high rates applied, and that way we could determine resistance factor, and that gives us an idea whether it's kind of, moderate or very high level of resistance. So this is a kind of example of where you have achieved 100% effective control by spraying that particular chemical. So I guess that's just to give you a brief kind of overview of how weeds evolve resistance. And there is a short video. Feel free to sort of go through and learn a bit more about how resistance is a number game and what kind of impact resistance can have on agricultural production systems. In next video, we'll just show you a very short, quick overview of our herbicide application system. So we have a spray chamber where we apply herbicides, and we'll show you how it works. And hopefully that gives you a sort of broad spectrum of what herbicides are, how they work, how they evolve resistance, and how do we go about testing herbicide resistance in lab, and then take those findings to the field. Thank you so much.